What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stokastic DFS channel. We are back with the second installation of the XFL DFS breakdown. Forewarning, I've been spending most of my time this week building a projection model and had an error with the data source, but had to go back, correct that. I've spent a lot of time on it. And now I think it's in a good place. But with that said, I have not been diving into the weeds of the usage. The model does do that. So that's what I will be referencing most in this video, giving you all the usage and data tips that we can use. But I'm also self-producing the show. So if it takes a little bit of time, my apologies ahead of time. We'll be trying to flip through tabs, produce the show all on our own, but we'll get it done. It'll be good. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. If you are listening on podcast, please leave a rating and review. That helps us a ton. We're brought to you by Prize Picks. They have a first match deposit bonus up to $100, and they have XFL. And if you want to use some of the information in this video, you absolutely can. I haven't got to look at the board just yet because I spent most of the week building the projection model and trying to fine tune it best we can. But we'll have those picks in the coming weeks moving forward. They did a great job with it, so make sure to check them out. I don't really have any graphics to show you, so congrats to you all. You get to see my DraftKings count again. We're going to go game by game just because I think it's the easiest to break everything down. And we'll have the pricing to reference on the screen. So hopefully this is something that helps. But again, feedback. We'll have more time in the coming weeks to kind of adjust the video as we get the data side of things all figured out. But we'll kick things off. We'll go game by game and team by team within the games. First one, we have the St. Louis Battlehawks taking on the Seattle Sea Dragons. St. Louis is a 3-point underdog. The total in this game is 36.5. It's the third highest on the board, which surprised me just having seen these two teams play. St. Louis, again, their head coach was Anthony Brecht, their OC was Bruce Gajewski. This was one of the teams we weren't sure how they were going to look. There were some rumblings that they would be pass heavy, and that's basically what they showed. 63.5% pass rate, which was solid, but they only ran 41 plays. This was the fewest plays out of anybody. But I think this team could be a little bit faster in the coming weeks. You're going to see some noise in these sample sizes. The pass rate was awesome. And this was a game they won 18-15 over the San Antonio Brahmas, but they were outgained. With that said, they still average more yards per play than the Brahmas. They averaged 9.3 yards per pass and 4.5 yards per rush. That was actually pretty efficient in terms of offense. And McCarron, like we thought, did look like the most talented passer in the league. He's not a guy that's going to run really whatsoever. He did run 4 times, but 3 of those were scrambles. As a passer, he was second in the league in YPA, and he completed 69% of his passes. So this is kind of what we were expecting from McCarron, and I actually think he's kind of a buy low. In the context of the entire slate, we'll just show you. He's still the most expensive quarterback, but just for reference in the back end of the model, given their pass rate and some regression we have in plays per game for this team, having it being a 1-game sample, he still projects as the second highest quarterback just in raw points overall. We'll talk about who projects ahead of him, but a lot of upside with McCarron still. With that said, the rest of the box score was kind of depressed for this team. We'll bring you to the run game. So Brian Hill, he had a great workload for this team, and he was near the top of the running back projections, which surprised me. But he handled 40% of the carries, which we can't say about a lot of these teams in the previous games. So Brian Hill immediately stands out. And if you look at his target share too, up at 12%. So, I mean, this is a guy that was involved a lot, and I don't really see this changing. He's a guy that actually has NFL talent to some degree. When we look at what he did on the field, he did turn in just 6 total attempts. But again, everybody on this team has kind of a bad box score because they ran so few plays. If you expand this out to actually like the league average in plays, which is just over 60, Brian Hill's going to project just fine. So he's a bit of a buy low, and I think that's the case with a lot of this team. Going to receivers, we'll talk a lot about routes and who we can target moving forward. But again, just know this team wildly underachieved in the first game. So looking at target shares, I think right away we can focus in on a couple players. The top two receivers were Marcel Aitman and Darius Shepard in terms of routes. Austin Prell was their third receiver. So we're talking 91% of the routes for Aitman, 100% for Shepard, and then 85% for Prell. Hakeem Butler, he had the touchdown, but that was just a 41% route share for him. And then the tight ends were complete afterthoughts. We had a rotation and nobody eclipsed a 24% route share on the tight ends. We're just going to completely ignore them for the most part. But in terms of targets and catches, I think this creates an opportunity to maybe buy low on Darius Shepard. His price didn't fall that much, but at 6,900, he ran the most routes on this team. So he's a player I certainly want to take a look at this upcoming week, especially with people maybe getting off McCarron in this team just because their box scores were so bad. And Prell, I mean, he's still 4.4K. He had the 17.9 points. He's probably a guy people will look at, I imagine. But again, I think the best buy low here is Shepard. Again, your top three receivers were Aitman, Shepard, and Prell. They all eclipsed 85% of the routes. Our second team, the Sea Dragons, they were also a pretty interesting team overall when we look at what they did on the field right away. In their first game, they had a 76.7% pass rate, and they ran 73 plays. That was the second most plays in this league, and then their pass rate was just absurd. This is the June Jones offense, so this is kind of what we were expecting. But they lost to the defenders, and honestly, it took a defensive score from the defenders. They had 4 points on their post-touchdown conversions, and Seattle didn't convert on some of those. So the difference in the game came down to some fluky plays because of defensive scores, and then overall, it looks like some teams understand the edge that can be created having the variable extra point, if you will, after, and other teams haven't quite figured it out. But that was a difference in the game. Anyway, they averaged 4.4 yards per play. The defenders were at 3.3. So a game Seattle should have won. Their quarterback, Ben DiNucci, I thought he played pretty well. He was spelled by Steven Montez for a few plays, but he had 3 rush attempts. One of them was a scramble, so that's decent. He finished with 54 pass attempts. Again, we talked about them running the second most plays and passing over 75% of the time. That resulted in 54 pass attempts, but only 283 yards. That's 5.2 yards per attempt. He did complete 65% of his passes, but ADOT was really low, 6.3. That was among the lower ADOTs in this league. Regardless whether the ADOT's high or not, whether the volume is efficient or not, Ben DiNucci is going to backdoor his way into some really productive games if they continue playing this fast and if they continue playing with this kind of pass rate. And again, June Jones was in the first rendition of the XFL. We have a larger sample of June Jones offenses compared to some of these other teams. Ben DiNucci right away projects as the highest quarterback on the board for us next week. It's close. It's very close. We're still really tight in terms of the pack, but the most pass attempts will do that for a team with an absurd 75% pass rate right now. And just for reference, we're projecting in regression in terms of plays per game and pass rate, and he still is that high. So again, for those of you that played college football DFS, he's like the Will Rogers of the XFL, where you have a largely average passer, but the volume just helps him backdoor his way to some really productive games. And I think that's the case. I think this is going to be a sneaky shootout. I have a lot of interest in just this game in general. Going to the backfield, we initially coming into the game, Brendan Knox was listed as the starter. He handled 65% of the rush attempts, but this team virtually non-existent in the pass game. They hardly targeted their running backs whatsoever. 2% target share. One of them was to like H-back tight end Charlie Tampano, and Morgan Ellison saw the other one. But as far as just raw running attempts, Brendan Knox with the 64% was among the better marks in this league. It's just going in, you have to realize that the pie is much smaller for this team when they have a 75% pass rate. So he projects for around 12 carries for us in the next game. That's with the regression and virtually no pass game work. So you have to understand that going in. It's going to be volatile for this team. I'm trying to pull up their routes in the back end just to give you guys some reference of what running backs were doing what in the pass game. And Knox did run 2 routes, but just the routes for this backfield was 8 Ellison. Hammonds is listed as a running back. He's not. It's basically 8 Ellison, 3 Tampano, and 2 Knox. So nobody active in the pass game on the backs. And that makes sense. They'll play 4 wide a lot, and we'll bring you to the receivers. So to put a bow on that, I think Knox is a fine price-adjusted play, but nothing really to write home about because he's not active in the pass game. We really need one of these guys to emerge in the pass game if we want consistent DFS viability. But this is the Josh Gordon team. You probably saw this team receive a lot of criticism for not playing Gordon on the final drive, and that is a concern. He only had a 71% route rate. That was 4th on the team. It was behind Blake Jackson. It was behind Ja'Cour Pearson. And it was actually behind Jordan Veazey, who was a surprising virtual starter for this team. You also had other ancillary receivers like Calvin McKnight at a 36% route share, Damian Willis at a 29% route share, and even Jawan Green at a 27% route share. So you can tell there's a lot going on in this pass game. But target leader, Ja'Cour Pearson, 26%. His route rate, second highest in the team at 83%. I think he's likely to be the wide receiver 1. He's very young, came out of Ole Miss 2 years ago. And Blake Jackson's listed as questionable. There's actually a couple injuries on this team. So injuries are going to be a very interesting part of this league to watch. But Blake Jackson, thumb injury. He was a limited participant. I think he plays. He had the highest route rate on the team. Jalen Redd did not play last week, and he has a hamstring injury, so we'll have to wait on his status maybe a little bit longer. Either way, I think your top 2 receivers to look at right now are Pearson and Blake Jackson. And it's no slight to Josh Gordon. His routes just need to climb. His targets need to climb. He was behind both Pearson and Blake Jackson. And right now, as long as he has this name recognition, I think you can still probably gain some leverage by the Josh Gordon fade. Not only is he expensive, this slate is a little tighter in pricing, but you also have like clear leverage plays that already had more volume. Anyway, sneaky shootout. Love this game total overall. Even though it's 36, I think it might go overlooked with it being the first game of the week. Next, we go to DC. What a mess this team was in the first game. Right away, the spread is 3.5 in favor of the Vegas Vipers. The total in the game is 36. So it's the lowest total, but it's close to the St. Louis-Seattle game. Again, I think this is far more likely to go under than the previous game we talked about. Looking at DC first, Fred Keiss was the OC for this team, Reggie Barlow, the head coach, and they were one of the worst offenses to watch in this league. They passed just 40% of the time and ran 54 plays. That was the second fewest. They won their game 22-18, but they had to have a defensive score. We just talked about that, 3.3 yards per play. They were well behind Seattle, but the defensive score and the 2-point conversions got it done for them. And they were losing most of the game. So this run heaviness, it seems to be a focal point of the offense, regardless of whether they win or lose. Unfortunately for DFS players and those of you that were playing cash games, a lot of you played Tiamu. He was in a quarterback split. That makes this a situation almost entirely to avoid, and one that has really frustrated me. Seeing the quarterbacks ahead of the season, I really wanted Derek King to get the start. Derek King is an electric college player. He was, at least. Played at Houston and then Miami, suffered, unfortunately, a torn ACL in one of his final seasons, but he was actually productive in college, whereas Jordan Tiamu's best quality is that he torpedoed an Ole Miss team that had DK Metcalf, A.J. Brown, and Dawson Knox to a 5-7 record. All Tiamu has is running ability. Derek King has that, but at least he's thrown for some productivity. Regardless, both these quarterbacks were horrible. King basically came in to run. He ran 7 times to Tiamu's 6. Both of them were terrible passers, like downright horrific. This team has a really low team total, and they've shown no willingness to pass, and they didn't use Tiamu a lot as a design runner. Them bringing in King for those situational design runs was a big issue for this team, and it kind of makes them untargetable unless you think that changes, which there's been no indication it will. The backfield, Raekwon Armstead, I believe this was an illness. I'm going to take a look quick. Never mind, it was an ankle injury. So he was a limited participant on Tuesday with an ankle injury. Abram Smith, the back out of Baylor, was the only other ball carrier to receive an opportunity. He handled 33% of the carries. Raekwon Armstead was at 24%. But again, the quarterbacks carried so much that it actually siphoned away carries from this backfield. Derek King was at 21%, 7 carries. Jordan Tiamu, 18%. That was 6 carries. So, I mean, we're talking about really tight spreads here. And If they committed to one quarterback, I think I'd have more interest in this backfield. Right now, because of the way it's broken down, Abram Smith looks like he's going to be a decent play on this slate, but he's still coming in around 7th, 8th, maybe 9th. I didn't count it out in terms of projection. And that's partially because of the involvement of the quarterbacks, but it's also because of the low team total and then the virtual non-existent pass game. Like we did an 11% target share for Raquel Armstead, and Abram Smith did not receive a target. Now, if Raquel's out, maybe more routes come Abram Smith's way, but this is a volatile situation. The last thing I'll say on this is the route rate for Abram Smith was higher than Armstead. We had a route rate of, let's see, he ran 14 routes and Abram Smith was at 14. Raquel Armstead was at 7. That was out of 26. So targets just did not go his way. Maybe Abram Smith is due for positive regression here. This is one we'll have to watch, but don't love it regardless. Among the actual receivers, this is an offense just based on the running. It's probably not one to look at, but Chad Hansen was sick last week, didn't play. Puka Williams didn't play. Now, the target leader, Lucky Jackson, he had a 28% target share. His route rate was at 75%, which is kind of an issue. Again, we just talked about a Seattle team that had like 4 guys above this. So the routes were Lucky Jackson, 75%, Josh Hammond, 83%, and Chris Blair at 79%. This situation is basically a disaster. I don't want any part of this unless it's just a stone min Chris Blair, and he would just be the guy that like rounds out the rotation. A lot of people played Jaquez Ezzard because he was so highly priced, just 25% of the routes. That's not going to get it done for you. Let's go to the Vegas side. This is a team that's a little more interesting overall. We'll pull up their team. Go to the quarterback position. Luis Perez. I mean, some people want tournaments with Luis Perez. Let's start with just the team environment before we go to him. A lot of thoughts. Dwayne Taylor was the OC, and I thought he showed out a little bit. I mean, 54.5% pass rate, ran 66 plays. That was 3rd highest. This looks like a pretty decent offense. The problem is, well, there's a couple problems. First off, Luis Perez, man, like great counting stats, but 2 pick sixes in the game that cost them the game. They lost 22-20 against the Renegades, game they should have won. Now, I mean, this was basically a defensive slugfest, but Vegas averaged more yards per play. Luis Perez outside of the pick sixes was good, and this just speaks to like the Jameis Winston factor. Throwing pick sixes isn't necessarily a bad thing for your quarterback, but he is the definition of a game manager. Almost everything league average. He does not run. He has no mobility, no rush attempts, no scrambles, took 3 sacks. Yards per attempt of 6.9, completion percentage of 6.1. The YPA slightly above average, the completion percentage slightly low. His ADOT was 7.6, like right on league average. He looks like a pure game manager who had an above average outcome considering his skill set. I think if people are going to go to him this week, I'll just fade for the second time and probably watch him burn me. But based on the efficiency metrics, Luis Perez did not show too much. In the backfield here, what a disaster this running attack was in the first game. But Rod Smith led a 3-way committee where he had handled 33% of the rush attempts, John Lovett 27%, and DeAndre Torrey 20%. Complete mess. As far as the pass game, the highest target share did go to Rod Smith. That was a 6% target share. But we're going to bring up the actual routes for you guys as I click between tabs. You can probably hear it. Oh, man, this is a disaster. It's basically split. We had Lovett 5, Torrey 4, man, and Rod Smith with a couple in there as well. He was at 13, so more than really anybody else. Rod Smith is the lead back of a 3-way committee. That makes him semi-interesting, but we're still talking about a running back on the outside looking in terms of raw projection. The team total does give him a little boost here, so I'll say that. He's like in the GPP range. Among the receivers, again, the pass rate was higher than I expected, so this is a spot we could maybe take a look at. What I like about this team and the receivers is they basically didn't rotate. You had Martavis Bryant, 97% of routes. Geronimo Allison, 97% of routes. Jeff Badette had the massive game, 92% of routes. And they actually went 4 wide a lot. This team ran a ton of weird personnel stuff. So you would see like Matthew Sexton, Sink Sweeting, they were at 38% and 31% of the routes. They would occasionally bring in multiple tight ends. Like there were formations where they would use all 4 tight ends, spread them out wide, use motion and stuff. This was a really nice offense. For target shares, Bryant 25%, Badette 25%, Geronimo Allison 19%. This is like exactly what you want. And with the pass rate being a little higher than expected, we could throw darts at this situation with really no problem. Martavis Bryant being the cheapest at 8,200, he's where I would look. Also just, former NFL player that was successful as well. I think the talent's still there for him. And Badette had the biggest game of his career. I mean, really since high school. Like, my goodness, Jeff Badette failed at Oklahoma, failed in every rendition of spring football until week 1, where he just nukes the slate. You guys can probably tell I didn't play him. Regardless, I'll be buying low on Bryant and Allison. Next game, we go to San Antonio, Orlando. This game has a much higher total, 39 points. 3-point spread in favor of San Antonio. This is the Jack Cohn team. First and foremost, we'll talk what the offense looked like. 48% pass rate. Middle of the pack, slightly below average. But they did run 75 plays. That was first in the league. So you're going to see Jack Cohn had a lot of attempts. But they lost 18-15. They were outgained. And they kicked 3 field goals and missed another, failing to maximize their scoring chances. So that is an issue here. Looking at the offense, I think there's a chance that this team could be better in the future, just based on what they did running so many plays. With Jack Cohn, I think he's pretty risky. He did have 4 rush attempts. 2 of them were scrambles, but we know this guy's not a runner. We've seen him in multiple offenses at this point. Played at Wisconsin, played at Notre Dame. I'm not expecting running here. But he did throw 36 times, largely because of the elevated play rate. But he is essentially quarterbacking a dink and dunk offense if everything remains the same. 5.8 yards per attempt on a 69% completion. That makes sense considering his ADOT was minuscule, 5.7 yards per attempt in terms of the ADOT. He looks like the definition of a league average signal caller who is just throwing the ball underneath every single play. Think of this like the NFL or the XFL version of what the Arizona Cardinals do, throwing the horizontal rate, as some call it. Anyway, for DFS, if they're going to run this many plays, Cohn's going to be interesting. I still would rather probably look elsewhere. His projection is pretty middling in the slate when he regressed for play volume. In the run game, holy smokes, Kalen Ballage had a monstrous role. 59% of the rush attempts, nearly a 10% target share. Kalen Ballage bursts onto the scene. He projects as our highest back by a couple points, and that's basically just because this workload was one of the few bell cow back workloads in the XFL. Sorry, I forgot to switch the tab. 7,100. This price is just not expensive enough for Kalen Ballage. Jock Patrick, he was a change of pace back, and Ballage honestly ran pretty bad to just get 12.7 points here. Monster workload for Ballage, and they're favored against Orlando here. At wide receiver, Landon Akers went on injured reserve, so that's the first thing I want to say here. He led the team in targets. He had a 22% target share. And this team was a mess, man. Like, the route leader was Jalen Tolliver, 82% of the routes, 15% target share. Akers was next at 69%. So this team signed a guy named Dan Williams up the street. I would expect the receiving pecking order to now be Tolliver 1, Travis Johnson 2, who had a 54% route rate, TJ Vasher 3, 46% route rate last week, Fred Brown 4, 36% route rate. I think Tolliver is probably the guy we want to focus on. He's 7,200, but I think this team's probably going to run like a rotation of 4 or 5 receivers. If you're taking a bet on another guy, it's going to be Vasher for me. Vasher just plays a different style of ball. I guess Johnson had a slightly higher route rate, but we're talking really close. Man, I don't know. This team is a bit of a mess. And their run rate being as high as it is, I think it might just be a Ballage or pass situation for this team, the San Antonio Brahmas. They fired whatever that guy was, like their GM or something. I don't know what his official position was, but this team's already kind of a mess. And speaking of mess, another team that is a complete mess, the Orlando Guardians. True to their word, they played multiple quarterbacks. They did not play all three. They only played two. But Robert Ford, their OC, he passed way more than we thought, 71%. They ran 55 plays. That was the third fewest. But the team also got smoked. They lost 12-33, which may have contributed to that elevated pass rate. They were outgained just 5.2 to 5.0 in terms of yards per play. So the yards per play was actually a little closer. But they used two quarterbacks, Quinton Dormady and Paxton Lynch. Quinton Dormady, 27 snaps. Paxton Lynch, 40. That was 67 total. Lynch only ran one time, and that was weird because he ran a lot in the USFL. Dormady didn't run at all. Neither quarterback was particularly good. Dormady did press the ball downfield, but he threw 2 interceptions. Lynch threw 1. The pair took 7 stacks. So, I mean, the offensive line wasn't great. And regardless, for DFS purposes, if we're talking timeshares at quarterback, we don't want to mess with this. Running back. A lot of people played Jermaine Martin, and true to their word, he handled 56% of the rush attempts. It's just that they got crushed so badly in this game that it didn't really result in him getting a ton of work. But if they end up playing competitive ball, I think Jermaine Martin, he has the backfield basically locked down. Interestingly, just a 2% target share for Jermaine Martin. I'm going to pull up the routes real quick just to make sure I'm not talking something that wasn't true. But 17 routes for Jermaine Martin. Kelvin Taylor did have 13, so it is a bit closer than maybe I thought it was going to be. But Jermaine Martin still a pretty good role in the pass game. He had a 36% route rate. That's actually pretty good. And Kelvin Taylor right behind him there. Would rather just play Jermaine Martin. I think you can go back to him at 8,100. We're still talking about a tighter price slate, but you can do a lot. You don't really have to worry too much about overall just salary restrictions. The receiving game, and I mean, you're basically playing one of these guys by themselves because, like, what do we do? I'm not playing Dormady and, like, trying to stack this offense. Even worse, they ran a nasty rotation. You basically had Charleston Rambo, 100% of the routes. Eli Rogers, 72. Nobody else above 55. Andrew Jamiel, 55. Dedrick Thomas, 49%. Stephen Goodry, 43%. Cody Latimer, 30%. Cody Latimer, the big game, 30% of the routes. My goodness. Dantes Bird, 26%. Tight end Logan Carter, 32. Ryan Becker, 11. The targets were split as well. The target leader, Eli Rogers, 18%. I mean, if I'm playing anybody on this team, I'm just playing Stoneman Eli Rogers. Not thinking about it. Again, the route rate for Latimer and Jamiel was so low. Jamiel was a little bit better, 55%, but Latimer, 30% of the routes. Like, my goodness, you can't play that, especially if it's going to be at decent ownership, which I think it probably will be. Regardless, Eli Rogers, I think he's the safest receiver right now, which is saying a lot. He also has, like, the most NFL talent among the group. Not a game I have a ton of interest in. I'm not going to lie. I think this one should have a lower total than Seattle and St. Louis, but neither here nor there. We move to our last game. Arlington taking on Houston. This one should be maybe the best game of the week. I think it's between this and the St. Louis-Seattle game, but Houston's still a 5-point favorite. Arlington, 40-point total overall. Their team total is 17.5, so it's still decent. And Arlington, talking about their offense as a whole to start here, they passed 46.5% of the time. They were in 56 plays, basically slightly below average in terms of pass rate, right around league average in terms of play rate. They did win, but it took 2 defensive scores for them to win, courtesy of Luis Perez. The gift that keeps on giving. Their quarterback, the Renegades now, Drew Plitt, did run 6 times, which is interesting. 2 of them were scrambles. He didn't do that in college. He completed 76% of his passes. ADOT was 8.6. His YPA was 6.9. That makes him, slightly above average in terms of really everything he did. It doesn't look like the offensive structure is going to provide a lot of upside for him, but in terms of efficiency numbers, he was actually pretty decent, better than I thought he was going to be. We're talking about a guy who came out of Ball State in the MAC. That's not exactly the highest level of competition, but he held his own, and what holds him back here is probably going to be his offense. And this is kind of what we thought. Bob Stoops is the head coach, but he brought in that stupid run-heavy offense from the old St. Louis Battlehawks with Jonathan Hayes and Chuck Long that was 3-2 before the league dissolved. Just smashing Jordan Tiamu into the back of the O-line. What a mess. Anyway, let's go to the run game for this team. Keith Ford, De'Veon Smith, Adrian Killins round out the running back room. De'Veon Smith, 48.5% of the running back carries. That is a very, very good number. He also handled the 12% target share. If this team's going to continue with their elevated run rate, and again, they were losing this game, took pick sixes for them to come back. They were still slamming De'Veon Smith. He's not efficient, but I mean, he has a good workload. He's among the most palatable running backs on this slate. I'm definitely interested in him. He has a high projection for us in the back end. And that's considering there's still underdogs in this game. So like De'Veon Smith quite a bit. Among receivers, Rennell Hall didn't play. As you can see, he's still questionable. That could affect things moving forward. But there's a tough situation. I actually like the receivers this team has. And I think there's a chance they could be a little better in future weeks if they can get that pass rate figured out. They basically didn't really rotate their starters. It was Tyler Vaughns as number 1, Brandon Arconato 2, and Jordan Smallwood 3. But really, we have to talk about Sal Cannella. He's the actual wide receiver 1 on this team. 32% target share, 93% route rate. He's ahead of Tyler Vaughns. Tyler Vaughns came in 97% route rate, 20% target share. Brandon Arconato third, 73% route rate, 20% target share. Jordan Smallwood, 53% route rate, 4% target share. He split time with Sean Monster and Lawan Winningham, and they did run a lot of double tight end sets. But again, Cannella, they basically can use as a receiver, so take that for what it's worth. Cannella's still way too cheap. And honestly, Tyler Vaughns at the stone minimum makes no sense whatsoever. He's one of the best price-adjusted plays on the slate. So even though I don't love the Arlington offense, I don't love the quarterback situation, I'm still probably going to be playing a couple of these really contrarian stacks because this is a good game environment and the receivers are way too cheap. And Cannella and Vaughns, they really stand out here in terms of price-adjusted plays. Last team, we talk about Houston. Okay. The Houston offense. 68% pass rate, 62 plays, above average in both. They demolished the Guardians, outgained them only by 0.2 yards per play, though. But Brandon Silvers, he played on 61 of 69 snaps. Cole McDonald briefly appeared. And when he did come in, it was basically for just like designed runs. Got 3 attempts. Silvers got 2 himself, but one of them was a scramble. Silvers was pretty average in terms of passing, 6.3 yards per attempt, 63% completion. But he did have the highest average depth of target in the league, so he pushed it downfield more than any other quarterback. And if McDonald doesn't come in and steal any like goal line work or anything, Silvers has one of the highest ceilings in this league. Their team total is really high this week as well. I think Silvers makes a lot of sense as a semi-contrarian play. He's also cheap too, which is shocking. At running back, this was a fun situation to evaluate, but weird. When we look at what happened, they actually used Max Borghi as an early down grinder, 42% of the carries, DeJuan Lee at 31%, but they used Nick Holley as the pass catching back. Nick Holley's 70% route rate. Max Borghi played with Mike Leach in Washington State. His route rate was just 19%. This is a full-blown 3-way committee, full-blown, and they all have their own roles. And unfortunately for Max Borghi, Nick Holley is the pass game back. It's not even close. I think overall, in terms of snaps, you're going to see Borghi and Lee split the first down work, and Holley almost exclusively handle third down work. It's rough. I think people will probably chase this situation given the efficiency Borghi in particular had. He had the long touchdown run. Going to receiver, Travell Harris is questionable for this game. I forget what's wrong with him. Unspecified. That's interesting. Anyway, we'll talk about who is there. This team does have a couple receivers that played a ton. Deontay Burnett, Jontre Kirkland, both had 100% of the routes. And Burnett had 27.5% target share. Kirkland was at 20%. Harris would be a big loss. Harris did have a 27.5% target share and an 85% route rate himself. So we're talking about somebody who could be a big loss for this team overall. I think the next man up is probably going to be Cedric Byrd, 34% route rate. Ben Putman had a 15% route rate himself, but Byrd was a little more active, 5% target share. If Travell Harris misses for whatever reason, I would expect Byrd to step up. Price is not too different, but that's where I would look overall. Burnett and Kirkland are the top 2 pass catchers here on this team. All right. that does it for the team-by-team breakdown. Let's talk about the top plays at each position briefly. You guys asked for it, so I'm trying to at least cater to some feedback before we get out of these streams. Want this to be your show, so let me know what you guys want, but we'll go full screen, and then I'll talk about this. All right, pulling up the projections just to briefly reference. All right, the top three guys, I think it'll come as no surprise that the first game has Ben DiNucci. Just, my goodness, the pass attempts so high. We talked about this. The efficiency is not going to be great for him, or at least it wasn't. That doesn't mean it can't change. But Ben DiNucci plays in the offense that basically is going to have the ability to backdoor into big games. And we saw that in week one. Just the pass attempts were so high. AJ McCarron is number 2 in terms of just raw projection. He plays in an offense that was semi-efficient, but overall he was the most efficient signal caller on the week. Neither of these guys offer you a lot in terms of running. And the last one we just talked about was Brandon Silvers for Houston. He was actually pushing the ball downfield more than any other team, but Houston's still very much a pass-first offense. And again, we don't have any running quarterbacks in this league. Unfortunately, the one team that did want to run the ball, they split the work down the middle between Tiamu and De'Aaron King, so that is very difficult to trust. Right now, I'm just playing the pocket passers with DiNucci, McCarron, and Brandon Silvers as the top 3 in terms of raw projection. The best value, believe it or not, it's actually projecting as Jack Cohn. That's just salary-adjusted projection. Running back, it'll come as no surprise that the number 1 projected back is Kalen Ballage. He's number 2 in terms of price-adjusted value, even at that expanded signal, or at that expanded price. I think he's still overall the one bell cow this league has based on the small sample. So he immediately projects as number 1. Good pass game role for him too. De'Veon Smith is number 2 in overall raw projection, and he's number 1 in price-adjusted projection just because that tag 5,700. Quietly, really good pass game for him too. And the last guy, Jermaine Martin. Unfortunately, he's on that Orlando team that got crushed, so it didn't really help him. The pass rate, I think, was a little elevated compared to what we expected, but there's still only 2 backs on that roster. If Orlando can keep games semi-competitive, he should have a much larger workload moving forward. He's still very much in play as a top 3 option at running back for me. Then at receiver, tight end, we're going to pair this grouping. We don't really need to talk tight end. If you're playing tight end, it's Sal Cannella. If you're talking receivers, number 1, Ja'Cory Pearson, just in that awesome offensive environment. Actually, there's 2 Seattle receivers among the top 3, and all 5 of the top receivers are on the same 2 teams. So Ja'Cory Pearson for Seattle, you can just tell Seattle's a great passing attack. Blake Jackson, great too. The second passing attack I want is Houston. Deontay Burnett leads that. I'll be looking at Jontre Kirkland as a secondary option and watching the Travell Harris situation closely from injury. In 3, I'm going to go Martavis Bryant, trying to buy low on the Vegas situation with Jeff Badet blowing up in week 1. We'll take the more talented player and try to grab a piece of this Vegas pie, hopefully buying a little low. But that'll do it for us today. Thank you guys so much for watching my monologues on the XFL. I appreciate you. Let me know in the comment section what you guys want to see. And if you want to hit me up on Twitter, you absolutely can. I'm available at Matt_Gajewski. We'll be doing this every single week. So feedback, and we'll try to make the show better over time. But good luck, everybody. Enjoy the XFL. I will see you guys again next week.